Thank you for joining us. We are excited to have you with us today as we take a closer look at the 25-26 Sorghum Quality Report, a valuable resource that highlights the consistency, performance, and overall quality of the U.S. sorghum crop. This report helps buyers, nutritionists, and industry partners better understand the characteristics and reliability of U.S. sorghum across our global markets. Today, we'll walk you through key findings from the latest crop, including production trends, quality metrics, and what that means for you. We are fortunate to be joined by two outstanding speakers who bring both technical expertise and an awesome perspective to the conversation. Let's begin with Lee Singleton, a senior consultant with Centric Consulting Group. Lee has been with the firm since 2012 and brings a strong background in financial analysis, agricultural finance, and market research. Lee will walk us through the report's findings and help us translate the data into meaningful insights. Following Lee, we'll hear from Florentino Lopez, who serves as an independent agricultural consultant. Through his work, Florentino supports the United Sorghum Checkoff Program and other organizations in promoting sorghum both domestically and internationally. He will provide an overview of the current crop, including production numbers and key trends shaping the market. We appreciate you taking the time to join us and help you find today's session informative. With that, I'll turn it over to Lee to get started.
Thank you, Shelee. Like Shelee said, my name is Lee Singleton with Centric Consulting. The U.S. Grains and Bioproducts Council is pleased to present the 2025-2026 edition of the Sorghum Quality Report. This is the 7th year of conducting this report in its current format. This survey is constructed by targeting 100 samples from the harvest areas shown on the map, the late harvest area and the early harvest area. It's a proportionate stratified sampling where we collect 81.5% of our samples, or target 81.5% of our samples from the late harvest area, which would include Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and the northern part of Texas. And then 18.5% of our sampling comes from the early harvest area, which predominantly includes the lower valley in Texas, up into Louisiana. Our early harvest area sampling only encompassed Texas this year, as there wasn't a sufficient amount of sorghum grown in that Arkansas, Louisiana area this year. But still, with the production in the early harvest area, 18.5% came from that lower portion of Texas. Ultimately, 102 samples were collected and tested. We worked with 18 commercial elevators and one very large farmer in the south part of Texas, the farmer, to collect these samples. Samples were collected from October 10th, 2025 through January 21st, 2026. We asked participating elevators and the farmer to submit 2,200 grams per sample to allow for enough sample material to be tested for all of the quality factors analyzed. Speaking of the quality factors analyzed, we tested for grade factors. And I should note that Amarillo Grain Exchange tested or did the grade factor testing. Amarillo Grain Exchange in Amarillo, Texas is a designated private agency for the Federal Grain Inspection Service, authorized to conduct domestic inspection and weighing services. So they are professionals at doing the grade factor testing. From there, a sub portion of the sample was sent to SGS laboratories in Vancouver, Washington, and analyzed for chemical composition, so protein, starch, and oil, tannins, and physical factors, including kernel diameter and 1,000 kernel weight. This presentation will go through the grade factors, chemical composition, and tannin testing, but we did test for a couple size metrics as well. Concerning the grade factors, so the first one would be test weight. This year we found that the U.S. aggregate test weight was 58.9 pounds per bushel, which was higher than the 5-year average. of 58.5 pounds per bushel, and much higher than last year of 57.7. This year's average was also higher than the U.S. #1 grade minimum for sorghum test weight of 57 pounds per bushel. Moving on to broken kernels and foreign material, the U.S. aggregate was 1.7%, which was similar to the 5-year average of 1.6% and lower than last year of 1.9%. It was also lower than the maximum U.S. #1 grade BNFM of 3%. Foreign material is a subset of BNFM, but it's also a grade factor itself with a maximum limit for U.S. #1 grade of 1%. This year, we found the U.S. aggregate BNFM in sorghum was 0.7%, which was the same as the 5-year average. Total damage in the 2025 crop was 0.1%, which was the same as the 5-year average and also lower than the maximum U.S. #1 grade limitation of 2.0%. No heat damage was found in the 102 samples collected, which was the same as the previous 5 years and also below the limit for U.S. #1 grade. This indicates good management of the drying and storage of sorghum. Protein this year was found to be 11.6%, which was higher than the 5-year average of 11.1%. I should note that these samples were analyzed with a FOSS NIR instrument, and this year was the first year where we tested a subset of 20 samples using wet chemistry methods by SGS to refine the calibration equations used by that NIR instrument. Starch was found to be 72.8% this year, which was similar to the 5-year average of 73.0%, but slightly lower than the previous year of 73.9%. Oil this year was found to be 3.5%. And I should note that due to methodology changes, year-over-year comparisons and the 5YA are not directly comparable. As noted earlier, with the wet chemistry sample testing that we conducted this year, it necessitated some slight changes to the calibration equations used. Oil was particularly different, which prevented us from comparing to previous years. Moving on to tannins, which the metric used to describe or communicate the tannin content would be milligrams catechtan equivalent per gram. Since the first year of doing this version of the report, anything below 4.0 milligrams CE per gram is considered an absence of tannins. Since the first version of this report, we have never received a sample testing greater than 4.0 milligrams CE per gram, which would equate to 0.4% tannins as a percent of the sample. This year, the testing methodology, 20 samples were tested using HPCL methods. From those 20 results, an NIR equation and calibration was used to approximate the remaining 80 samples. In previous years, the vanillin HCl test was used, where spectrophotometer is used to quantify the tannin concentrations. All 102 samples were tested. All were less than 4.0 milligrams CE per gram, as with the previous 6 reports. And I know we're using the 4.0 as a cutoff to imply an absence of tannins, but we can even go more granular than that. And we haven't, in this chart showing the last 3 years, we don't even have samples approaching 4. We could split that in half and go 2, and we would still not have a sample above 2. Really, we have found an absence of tannins across all of the samples we've received for all of these surveys. So in conclusion, the 2025-2026 sorghum samples were on average better than the US #1 grade specifications for all grade factors. And 100% of the samples contain below 4.0 milligrams catechin equivalents per gram. This implies an absence of condensed tannins throughout the entire crop.
Perfect. Thank you, Lee, very much. Now we'll turn it over to Florentino Lopez.
Lee, thank you so much for the update on the Sorghum Quality Report. My name is Florentino Lopez. As Shelee mentioned earlier, I tried to help the Sorghum Checkoff as an independent consultant to hopefully share as much information as possible, both here domestically as well as internationally. I'm going to be covering a couple of topics, but I did want to start off first with a sorghum overview. I felt that it's important to kind of go back over some of the certain items of the sorghum production area as well as some other items. So one part that's really important is to give you a little bit better understanding of where sorghum is grown in the U.S. As you'll quickly notice, sorghum grows from the far southern region of Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, all the way up into the area of Nebraska and South Dakota, primarily in the center of the country. Of course, you can see the different areas and kind of their names or their growing regions. One thing that I think is also very important, as Lee mentioned earlier about the crop that is currently being sold, it's also important to recognize that the far southern region of Texas will start harvest in a very short period. The harvest in South Texas will begin in the June timeframe. So we are already seeing sorghum that has entered that maturity level. We'll see some pictures a little bit later. But again, that crop will start harvest in June and will end harvest in December. Also, another area that I felt was important is export avenues. One thing that's important is to really recognize, where does sorghum come from or how does it exit the country? The majority of the sorghum that is exported leaves from the Gulf. About 77% actually exits the country through the Gulf, 18% through the Pacific, and 5% from the interior. The interior being the majority of it going by rail directly into Mexico. One item in Lee's comments was talking specifically about the quality of sorghum. I believe all of you recognize the quality of sorghum, those that have utilized it, and also recognize that the majority of sorghum moves very quickly. Although this report is now kind of being released, it's important to note that as of March 31st, when USDA mentioned its last report on grain stocks, at that time, there was a representation, we believe, of about 3 million metric tons that were still available of sorghum. Now, currently, if we add in not only the purchases that have occurred since that March 31st reporting, but also with the amount that we expect to be carried over, there really is only about 1.8 million metric tons of available sorghum. So again, although that report is an excellent indication of what is taking place for the quality of sorghum going out, the majority of that sorghum has already been purchased. Again, this gives you a big part of not only recognizing the sorghum quality, but also recognizing that you need to purchase sorghum quickly as that production takes place. On the sorghum PS&D, really important part of what I wanted to share, I did want to go into a little bit more about the actual inventories overall and the production overall. This first slide really talks about world sorghum PS&D. From a world perspective, this on the 5-year averages, production has averaged roughly 60 million metric tons, with exports averaging about 8.9 million metric tons. One key item to remember is the U.S. represents roughly 55% of all the sorghum exports worldwide. So very quickly, as we can see, in the 25-26, exports are expected to be about 9.9 million metric tons. We'll quickly see on the next slide how much of that is from the U.S. Again, production overall, 63 million metric tons for the current year. Of that, roughly 9.9 exiting on world exports. If we look at the U.S., again, from a U.S. 5-year average data, we see that production has averaged about 8.8 million metric tons. That is actually makes the U.S. the largest producer worldwide. So again, this is an ongoing item. The U.S. has maintained that #1 spot since, I believe, since really in the 2000s or even prior to that. So that number definitely has continued on. As you can see, in 25-26, we had a very large crop, 11 million metric tons, again, making that average of 8.8 very strong overall. Exports have averaged 4.9 million metric tons for the last 5-year period. At this point, that literally represents about 55% of all of the sorghum exports worldwide being represented by the U.S. Current export commitments are at 4.5 million metric tons. If the numbers hold up from USDA, we expect that exports will hit 5.7 million metric tons. If we remember that slide previously, we knew that there was roughly about 1.8 million metric tons available. 5.7 minus the 4.5, we need about 1.2, 1.3 million metric tons of additional export commitments, which we are very much in line with available inventories to be able to fulfill that number. Again, that should give you a confidence of knowing that there is available sorghum, but also one item that I believe is important is already looking into the next year. I believe it's important always to forward look at what has taken place. And that's really what I wanted to hit next, is looking ahead at the new crop is definitely something that's important. On sorghum prospective plantings, USDA yearly on March 31st issues a report that talks specifically about the intended acreage that is expected to be planted by U.S. farmers. At this point, USDA, on its estimates, has recorded 6.1 million acres of sorghum to be planted in the U.S. This actually represents a decline of about 7% from the previous year. Of course, this is a preliminary number, but it's important to have an indication of what that would look like. Based on those numbers, what I tried to do, or what we tried to generate, was a production volume expectation. You'll quickly note this is all for the coming year. You'll quickly note that there are three different categories: an 8260, an 8565, and an 8770. What those numbers represent is a harvest acre percentage as well as a yield number. So in the case of 82, that would mean that we would harvest 82% of the current planted acres with a yield of 60 bushels per acre. On the other side of that spectrum is 87% harvest acreage compared to actual planting, and a yield of 70 bushels per acre. So if we take into account, I expect that currently the volume expectations will fall somewhere between 7.5 million metric tons to 9.5 million metric tons. Again, looking at where we should generally fall would be between those ranges. As you remember, last year we had 11 million metric tons of production, so we are slightly below that number. Of course, weather, all kinds of factors go into that calculation. That's one reason that I talk a lot about the harvest ratio between that 82 to 87%. Considering drought, it could be less. Considering great rainfall and great growing conditions, it could be better than that 87. Speaking of drought, I did want to give you some indicators of what is taking place. This is information that's produced weekly by USDA. Currently, on the left, you will quickly note April 14th. Although we have received rains here this week, we do know that the trend for drought overall is slightly higher than it was at this same time last year. Again, that is not a perfect indicator of what the crop will do, but it starts to give you an indication of what might be going on with the crop. I did want to point out some of the crop now in the Rio Grande Valley. These are actual pictures from yesterday of the crop that is growing in the Rio Grande Valley. Based on these pictures, we still believe that there's some great growing conditions that are occurring in the lower Rio Grande Valley. As you can see also, this sorghum is already changing color. So it is quickly maturing. It is getting to that point where we will start harvesting it in that June timeframe. So again, I recommend that you continue to look at what has taken place, not only with the old crop, but also with the new crop that is quickly maturing and getting to that point of needing export opportunities. Again, as Lee mentioned earlier, the crop conditions and the crop quality from last year were excellent. We believe this year has started off very positive as well. And we look forward to sharing more about not only the crop quality for the current year, but also the crop production for the oncoming year as well. As always, if I can be of assistance, please let me know. I know that we try to be as helpful as possible, and I look forward to having more discussions with you in the near future.
Thank you very much, Florentino. And we appreciate Florentino and Lee and their information that they were able to share today. We also appreciate our buyers' interest in U.S. sorghum and hope you found this session informative and helpful. For more information, please scan the QR code you see on your screen. We also encourage you to reach out to your U.S. Grains and Bioproducts rep with any additional questions. Thank you and have a great day.